The sound of my chair scraping backward cut through the ballroom before I even had a chance to sit down. My sister's hand was wrapped around the carved wooden back, her knuckles pale against the polished mahogany. Alyssa had crossed the room so quickly that the skirt of her wedding gown was still swaying behind her. For half a second, I thought she was moving the chair to make room for someone. Then she looked directly at me. "This table is for family," she said, "not you." The conversations around us died one by one. A fork struck a plate somewhere behind me. The string quartet near the dance floor kept playing, but even the music seemed to shrink beneath the silence. I looked down at the place card in front of me. Caroline Mercer. My name was printed in gold beneath a small arrangement of white roses. I had not wandered into the wrong section. I had not taken someone else's seat. That place had been assigned to me when the seating chart was finalized 2 weeks earlier. Alyssa knew it. I raised my eyes to hers. "You moved my seat because I wouldn't sign your papers. Don't pretend this is about family." A flash of panic crossed her face, but it disappeared before most people could have noticed. She tightened her grip on the chair. "This is my wedding," she said. "For once, you don't get to control what happens." I could feel every person at the table watching me, waiting to see whether I would argue, cry, or make the scene Alyssa clearly expected. My ears burned, and my fingers closed tightly around the strap of my purse, but I refused to give her the performance she wanted. I picked up my purse, straightened my shoulders, and turned toward the ballroom doors. At the time, I thought Alyssa had only ruined her own wedding. I didn't know she had also exposed the one weakness keeping her deal alive. Before I tell you what happened after I walked away, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because this night was only the beginning, and please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what came next. I had taken 3 steps when I heard another chair move. My grandmother Ruth stood at the head of the table. She was 82, dressed in a dark blue suit Alyssa had complained was too plain for the photographs. One hand rested on the old leather reservation book she had brought for her toast. The other pressed against the table as she rose. "Grandma," Alyssa said sharply. Ruth did not look at her. She picked up the book and slipped it beneath her arm. My Aunt Linda stood next. She did not announce herself or glare across the room. She simply folded her napkin, placed it beside her untouched plate, and joined my grandmother. Then my cousin Daniel pushed back his chair. His wife followed. Marcus Hill, who had worked beside our mother in the first Mercer's table kitchen, stood from the next table. So did his husband. Another chair moved, then another, the sound traveling through the ballroom like a line of falling dominoes. I stopped near the doors. "You don't have to do this," I said. Aunt Linda crossed the room toward me. "We're not doing it because you asked." Behind her, more relatives were standing. Some were family by blood. Others had worked in our restaurants so long that the distinction no longer mattered. 2 location managers, our head chef, the woman who handled payroll, 3 senior servers, and nearly every cousin at the family tables gathered their coats and purses. My grandmother finally looked at Alyssa. "I stayed quiet when I should have spoken before," she said. "I won't do it again." Alyssa's face hardened. "You're all seriously walking out of my wedding because Caroline didn't get the seat she wanted?" No one answered her. That was what made it worse. By the time I reached the hallway, 47 people had followed me out of a wedding with roughly 110 guests. Because most of us had been seated together on one side of the ballroom, the room suddenly looked as if someone had cut the celebration in half. A few of my cousins were furious enough to turn around. "She needs to apologize in front of everyone," Daniel said. "No," I told him. "She just told you that you weren't family." I heard her. Marcus looked toward the closed ballroom doors. "Then let us go back in there." "This is still her wedding," I said. "I'm not turning a business dispute into a public trial." Aunt Linda stared at me. "She already turned it into one." "Then I'm not helping her finish it." My voice was steadier than I felt. The humiliation had reached me. I was not made of stone. My sister had looked me in the eye in front of more than 100 people and declared that I did not belong to the family whose company I had spent 15 years helping keep alive. But walking back inside to shout at her would not change the operating agreement. It would not reveal what she had hidden in the proposed sale. It would only allow her to claim that I had destroyed her wedding because I could not stand losing control. The ballroom doors opened behind us. Ethan stepped into the hallway without his jacket. He was 34, usually composed, but that night his expression looked caught between anger and disbelief. His eyes moved over the group surrounding me. "What happened?" No one answered immediately. Then he looked at me. "What did you do to her?" The question stung, but I understood where it came from. Alyssa had spent months telling him that I interfered in every decision she made, that I treated our family company like a private kingdom and everyone else like employees inside it. "I refused to sign a transaction she hasn't explained honestly," I said. His brow tightened. "What transaction?" "That's a question for your wife." "Caroline." Half the ballroom just walked out. I didn't ask them to. He looked toward my grandmother. Ruth gave him a small, tired nod, confirming it. Ethan lowered his voice. "Alyssa said you were trying to block the family from moving forward because you couldn't stand not being in charge. She's allowed to say that." "Is it true?" "I have 35% of the company and a legal responsibility to review any sale of its major assets. That isn't jealousy, it's my job." "Then show me what you found." "I can't hand confidential company records to someone who isn't a member of the company." I kept my tone calm. "But you can ask Alyssa why she needed my signature before Monday. You can also ask why she told Grandma all 4 restaurants would remain open." Something shifted in his expression. I did not press it. "Go back inside," I said. "This is your wedding night. Decide what questions you need answered after the guests leave." Ethan stood there for another moment, then returned to the ballroom. Later, Linda told me Alyssa immediately began telling the remaining guests that I had planned the walkout. She said I was jealous, controlling, and furious that she had found a way to save the company without me. My father stayed inside. When he eventually came into the hallway, he did not ask whether I was all right. He asked me not to make the situation worse. "I'm leaving," I said. "That's the opposite of making it worse." "You know what I mean." I did. He wanted me to absorb the insult quietly so the rest of the evening could proceed, without forcing him to choose between his daughters. He had made the same choice for most of our lives. I told him I would speak to him on Monday, and walked toward the hotel entrance. Cold March rain streaked the glass doors. Marcus had offered to open the original restaurant so everyone had somewhere private to sit, but I needed a few minutes before I could face anyone. My phone vibrated inside my purse. The email came from a Northline Hospitality Integration Coordinator, whose name I did not recognize. The subject line read, "Transition Planning Mercer's Table." I opened it beneath the hotel awning, while rain tapped against the pavement. "Congratulations on reaching agreement in principle," the message began. "We look forward to meeting all 4 members and beginning transition planning Monday morning." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. I had never agreed in principle. I had refused to sign the documents Alyssa and my father had placed in front of me 1 week earlier. I had told them I would not approve any transaction until I saw the full integration plan, the employee protections, and the financial assumptions behind Northline's offer. Yet my name appeared on the meeting invitation, as if my approval had already been secured. I looked back through the glass doors. From the lobby, I could see a sliver of the ballroom, and the golden light spilling through its entrance. Somewhere inside, my sister was still wearing her wedding dress and telling people I had walked out because I could not control her. But Alyssa had not only moved my chair that night. She had moved my name onto a deal I had refused to sign. Marcus unlocked the original Mercer's table 25 minutes after we left the hotel. By then, the cold March rain had turned the streets black and glossy, and most of us had stopped speaking. No one looked like they had come from the same wedding. My cousins stood beneath the restaurant's warm pendant lights in formal dresses and damp overcoats. Aunt Linda still wore the pearl earrings Alyssa had chosen for the family photographs. Grandma Ruth sat in her navy suit at the corner table where my mother used to balance the books after closing. Marcus turned on only the lights above the bar and the kitchen pass. He brewed coffee, set out water, and left the dining room sign facing closed. It did not feel like a victory. 47 people had walked out behind me, but the humiliation still sat beneath my ribs like something sharp. I had spent 15 years making sure our employees were paid, our vendors trusted us, and our family business survived every bad season. My sister had reduced all of that to one sentence in front of a ballroom full of people. Not family. Grandma placed the old leather reservation book on the table. The cover was cracked along the spine, and the gold lettering had almost disappeared. My mother had used it when Mercer's table was still one narrow dining room with 12 tables, and a kitchen barely large enough for 3 people. Alyssa had complained when Grandma brought it to the wedding. She said it looked dirty, Grandma murmured. She wanted me to hold something prettier during the toast. She opened the book carefully. The early pages contained reservations written in my mother's slanted handwriting. Farther back, she had listed the names of people who helped when the restaurant first opened. Aunt Linda had covered payroll before there was money to hire anyone. Marcus had washed dishes before he became a chef. 2 of my cousins had painted the dining room after school. Many of the people named in those pages were sitting around us. Grandma pressed one finger against my name. Next to it, my mother had written, "Caroline notices what everyone else misses." I closed the book before anyone could see my expression. Aunt Linda pulled out her phone. "There's something you need to see." She opened the wedding group thread. Linda had been listed as the family logistics contact because Alyssa did not want vendors calling her during the final week. A message from the wedding coordinator had arrived Thursday afternoon. Per Alyssa's request, Caroline Mercer has been reassigned from Table 1 to Table 12, near the service entrance. Please confirm whether the updated place card should be printed. Linda had responded before she understood what was happening. "Why is Caroline being moved?" The coordinator had never answered. 10 minutes later, Alyssa sent a separate message saying she would handle it personally. Grandma looked down. "I found the new place card yesterday morning." "You moved mine back," I said. She nodded. "I thought Alyssa was angry. I thought if she saw your name at the table, she would calm down and remember what day it was." "She remembered exactly what day it was," Linda said. "I took screenshots of the thread and emailed them to myself. I did not post them. I did not send them to the guests still at the hotel. A seating dispute would not stop a sale, but it established something important. Alyssa had planned to remove me before I ever entered the ballroom." Grandma folded her hands over the reservation book. "She told me Northline was investing in us." The room quieted. "What exactly did she say?" I asked. "That they would bring in new systems and help all 4 restaurants grow. She said no one would lose a job." "Did she show you anything?" "A summary. Nothing with numbers." "Did you sign it?" "No." Grandma's eyes sharpened. "I told her I would consider it if the restaurant stayed open and the employees were protected. She said that was already understood." It was the first useful distinction of the night. Grandma had not approved a sale. She had agreed to review one based on promises Alyssa had made verbally. By midnight, I sent everyone home. Marcus offered me the apartment above the restaurant, but I drove to my condo. I needed distance from the hotel, the restaurant, and every person who wanted me to decide what happened next. Ethan called Sunday morning. I nearly let it go to voicemail. Then I remembered his face in the hallway and answered. "Alyssa says you planned that," he said without greeting. "I didn't. She says Grandma changed the seating chart because you told her to. I learned Grandma changed it after we left." He was silent for a moment. "Why would Alyssa move you?" "Because I refused to approve the Northline transaction. She said it isn't a sale. She said it's a partnership." "Then ask her why the documents require approval to transfer major assets and brand rights. You have 35% of the company, correct?" "Yes. And you can stop it. The operating agreement can stop it. I'm one of the people required to approve it." "That sounds like the same thing." "It isn't." I kept my voice level. "A legal responsibility is not the same as a personal veto." He exhaled slowly. "Alyssa says you have blocked every serious change she has tried to make. That accusation, I have rejected proposals that did not have budgets, staffing plans, or reliable projections," I said. "Have you ever let her revise them?" I did not answer quickly enough. Ethan noticed. "I'm not saying she handled last night well," he said, "but she believes you would rather keep control than let the company grow." "She may believe that. Then show me what you found." "I can't give confidential company records to someone who isn't a member. I'm her husband. You've been her husband for less than 24 hours. That does not make you an owner. His tone hardened. So, I'm supposed to trust you? No. Ask your wife why she needs my signature before Monday. Ask what she promised Grandma. Ask whether all 4 locations remain open. The call went quiet again. Finally, Ethan said, "We postpone the flight." I had not asked about the honeymoon. Alyssa said she couldn't leave while you were threatening the deal, he added. I haven't threatened anything. You walked out with half the wedding. I walked out alone. The others made their own decision. He ended the call without saying goodbye. Monday morning. I was in the conference room at our corporate office before 8. Priya Nair arrived with her laptop and a folder of financial reports. Our company attorney joined by video. I forwarded the Northline email and the wedding thread screenshots, then asked for a formal preservation notice. Priya looked at me over the top of her glasses. What scope? Company email, customer records, transaction documents, access logs, forecasts, and anything related to Northline. The attorney added, only Mercer's table records for now. We don't control Northline's internal systems. That's fine, I said. I want what we legally have, not what we wish we had. The transition call began at 9. Olivia Grant appeared on screen from Northline's Chicago office. She introduced herself as Director of Integration and thanked us for moving quickly. Then I interrupted. Before we discuss transition, I need the record to reflect that Mercer's table has not approved this transaction. Olivia stopped speaking. Alyssa's camera was off, but her voice came through immediately. Caroline is still reviewing the final materials. No, I said. I reviewed the summary you gave me and refused to sign. Those are different statements. Olivia looked toward someone off camera. We were told all members had reached agreement in principle. Who told you that? Alyssa answered before Olivia could. Dad and I signed the support letter. Grandma agreed. You said you would review the rest. I said I would not approve anything until I saw the full integration model. The attorney stepped in and clarified that the support letter was non-binding and did not satisfy the 75% approval requirement. Olivia ended the transition portion of the meeting. She agreed to pause planning until Northline's legal team confirmed the voting status. By noon, our attorney had restored my access to the shared transaction data room. It did not contain Northline's private messages or negotiations, but it contained the buyer summary, integration assumptions, and location model Alyssa had repeatedly called a growth plan. I opened the map first. 4 Mercer's table locations appeared as blue markers. The original restaurant was labeled Flagship Retention. The other 3 were marked Consolidate within 2 quarters. I scrolled to the staffing assumptions. The proposed organization retained less than half our current management team. There were no individual names, but the reductions were clear. Northline was not planning to help all 4 restaurants grow. It was planning to buy the name, preserve 1 location as proof of authenticity, and remove the rest. At the bottom of the buyer summary was a list of people who had acknowledged reviewing the materials. Alissa Mercer. Martine Mercer. My father had not merely heard about the plan from Alyssa. He had opened the document himself and confirmed that he had reviewed it. I stared at his name until the letters blurred. My father had not been fooled from outside the deal. He had been sitting inside it. The next morning, I unlocked the original Mercer's table before sunrise. The dining room was still dark, except for the blue-gray light coming through the front windows. I stood behind the host desk with my hand around the same brass key I had carried for 15 years. The teeth were worn smooth in places, and the red plastic tag had cracked so long ago that I had wrapped it with black tape. My mother had given me that key when I was 23. Back then, I had been working as an assistant operations manager for a hotel group outside Columbus. I had a small apartment, decent health insurance, and a supervisor who had already mentioned promoting me within the year. I was not wealthy, but my life belonged to me. Then my mother died. Elaine Mercer had opened the first restaurant with Grandma Ruth's savings and more confidence than cash. By the time we lost her in 2011, the business had expanded too quickly. Our vendors were waiting on payments, and my father had suffered a mild stroke that left him frightened of every decision. Everyone assumed I would come home and fix it. I did come home, but I did not agree to become the unpaid daughter who sacrificed everything while everyone else kept their options open. I hired my own attorney before I accepted responsibility. The estate had already been placed in a trust, and we amended the operating agreement as part of the transition. I received a salary, 35% ownership, and actual authority over operations. I refused to personally guarantee every old debt, and I required quarterly financial reviews. My father called those conditions cold. I called them the reason I was still there 15 years later, instead of bankrupt and resentful. The first 2 years nearly broke us anyway. I renegotiated vendor terms, cut a menu that was too large, closed for 3 days to repair a kitchen we could no longer pretend was safe, and worked more double shifts than I could count. But I was not alone, even though I had sometimes told the story that way. Marcus had been there before me. Aunt Linda had handled payroll when we could barely pay her. Grandma had deferred distributions from her 20% share so we could keep cash in the company. And Alyssa, though she was only 16 when our mother died, had grown into someone who contributed more than I liked to admit. By the time she became our brand director, she had transformed the way people saw Mercer's table. She built our social media presence, created a Sunday brunch campaign that filled tables we used to leave empty, and brought in customers who had never heard my mother's name. She also proposed online ordering, bottled sauces, event packages, and a loyalty program. I had rejected most of them. Some of my reasons had been valid. Her budgets were incomplete. Her staffing assumptions were optimistic. She liked ideas that photographed well before she knew whether they made money. But I had not always helped her improve them. Sometimes I had simply written, "not financially viable." Once, after she spent 2 weeks building a proposal for a retail sauce pilot, I told her, "Pretty packaging doesn't cover payroll." She had gone silent. At the time, I had considered that the end of the discussion. Standing in the empty restaurant years later, I understood that Alyssa had probably considered it proof that the discussion had never truly begun. The kitchen door opened behind me. Marcus entered carrying 2 coffees. He set one beside the register and looked around the dining room. "You sleep?" he asked. "Enough. That means no." I opened my laptop at a corner table. Northline plans to close 3 locations. He sat across from me without touching his coffee. "How certain?" "The integration model says consolidation within 2 quarters. His jaw tightened. Marcus had helped open the 2nd and 3rd locations. He knew the managers, the dishwashers, and the servers who had planned their lives around those schedules. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Stop the transaction." And then, I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, stopping something isn't the same as leading us somewhere else." It was almost the same question Ethan had asked. "The company survived before Northline," I said, "because you carried too much of it yourself. That kept people employed." "It did." Marcus leaned back. "It also taught every manager in this company to wait for Caroline before making a decision. I gave managers authority. You gave them authority until they made a choice you didn't like." The words irritated me because they were not entirely wrong. "I'm not the one stealing clients or hiding a sale," I said. "I didn't say you were." His voice remained calm. "Alyssa can be wrong, and you can still have made it hard for anyone else to grow here." I closed my laptop more sharply than necessary. Marcus stood and picked up his coffee. "You asked years ago why good managers kept leaving after 18 months. Maybe some of them wanted to manage." He walked into the kitchen before I could answer. At 10, I met with our company attorney by video. Priya joined from her office with the operating agreement open on her screen. The lawyer confirmed that the support letter Alyssa and my father had signed was non-binding. It allowed Northline to conduct due diligence, but it did not authorize a sale. A transfer of major assets or brand control requires 75% approval, he said. Alyssa, Martin, and Ruth together hold 65. So they need me. Yes. Can Alyssa remove me as managing member? Not because you disagree with the sale. What can she do? She can argue you are acting against the company's interests. She can claim oppression as a minority member. She can seek an injunction if she believes you are withholding information or retaliating. I'm the one being denied access. Then document it. Do not make emotional decisions. Do not suspend anyone until you have cause and the votes required under the agreement. Priya scrolled to another section. An officer can be temporarily suspended by a majority, excluding that officer's own interest, she said. Caroline and Ruth would have 55% without Alyssa. If Ruth agrees, I said. And, if you have evidence, the lawyer added. Suspicion is not enough. I hated how slowly legal protection moved when someone else was already acting, but I understood the warning. If I used my authority carelessly, I would hand Alyssa the exact argument she needed. After the call, I drove to my father's house. He lived 15 minutes from the restaurant in the same brick colonial where Alyssa and I had grown up. My mother's rose bushes were still planted along the front porch, though no one maintained them properly anymore. Martin let me in without asking why I was there. I placed the Northline buyer summary on the kitchen table between us. You reviewed this, I said. He looked at his name at the bottom of the document. Alyssa walked me through it. That wasn't my question. Yes, I reviewed it. You saw that 3 locations could close. I saw that they might consolidate underperforming locations. Those locations employ more than 100 people. Northline said there would be opportunities. Where? He rubbed one hand over his face. Caroline, I am 64 years old. I don't want to spend the rest of my life worrying about food costs and bank covenants. You don't run the company now. I still own part of it. And you were willing to sign away 3 locations without speaking to me. His expression hardened. Speaking to you has never changed your mind. That does not make secrecy acceptable. You decide what is acceptable for everyone. The accusation landed harder coming from him. I came home when you couldn't manage this, I said. And since then, no one has been allowed to forget it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked, did you know Alyssa told Northline I had agreed in principle? No. Did you know she promised Grandma every location would stay open? No. Did you tell Alyssa I accessed the data room? He looked toward the window. That hesitation was enough. My phone vibrated on the table. Priya had sent a message. Your data room permissions were changed 10 minutes ago. Several folders are now restricted. I read it twice, then looked at my father. He had not planned the deception. He had not understood all of it. But he had warned Alyssa the moment I got close. I had confronted him before I knew enough, and Alyssa had used the time I gave her. For the first time since the wedding, I understood that being right would not be enough. I would have to be patient enough to prove it. By 9 the next morning, Northline had restored some of my access, but not all of it. Our attorney had spent 2 hours arguing that I was still Mercer's Table's managing member and had the right to review any material our company had placed in the shared transaction room. Northline's legal team agreed to reopen the buyer summary, integration assumptions, and financial forecasts. They did not give me access to private conversations, internal negotiations, or anything Northline alone controlled. That distinction mattered. I wanted answers, but I did not want evidence obtained through a shortcut Alyssa could later use against me. Priya sat across from me in the conference room while I checked the restored folders. Several documents are still missing, she said. Were they ever in our section? I can't prove that. Then we don't accuse anyone of deleting them. She nodded once. That was why I trusted her. Priya cared more about what could be established than what anyone wanted to believe. At 10:15, an email from Alyssa reached every manager, family member, and senior employee in the company. The subject line read, "The future of Mercer's Table." She wrote that Northline had offered our family financial security, improved systems, and a chance to protect the company from rising costs. She said one member was threatening that opportunity because she could not tolerate losing control. She did not use my name until the 4th paragraph. Caroline has rejected nearly every meaningful attempt to modernize this company, she wrote. Now she is using a personal disagreement at my wedding to interfere with a transaction that could protect our employees and allow our father to retire with dignity. The message was carefully written. Alyssa did not mention 3 locations marked for consolidation. She did not mention that Grandma's support had been conditional. She did not mention that Northline believed I had already agreed. Instead, she listed ideas I had rejected over the years. Online ordering, retail sauces, Event packages. A customer loyalty program. Some of those proposals had been incomplete, but reading them together made me look less cautious and more determined to stop anything I had not created. Replies began arriving within minutes. Marcus forwarded the email to me with one sentence: "Do not answer this while you are angry." I had already written half a response. I deleted it. By noon, 2 cousins had called to ask whether I was putting Martin's retirement at risk. One location manager wanted to know whether the restaurants were actually in financial trouble. Another employee asked if Northline would provide better health insurance. Alyssa had done more than defend herself. She had turned every uncertainty in the company into a reason to pressure me. I asked Priya to prepare a factual internal notice, stating only that no transaction had been approved and that normal operations would continue. We did not mention the wedding. We did not accuse Alyssa of lying. We did not promise anyone that every job was safe before we knew what our own numbers could support. Martin came to the office that afternoon without calling first. He closed the conference room door behind him and placed both hands on the back of a chair. "You made me look like I was trying to sell everyone's jobs," he said. "I didn't send Alyssa's email. You showed Grandma that document. Grandma owns 20% of the company. She had the right to see it." He pulled out the chair and sat. He looked older than he had at the wedding, but I reminded myself that guilt and exhaustion did not erase responsibility. "I never saw the detailed staffing model," he said. "Alyssa showed me the summary. She said consolidation was standard language, Northline included in every proposal. You acknowledged reviewing the buyer summary. I reviewed what she explained. That is not the same as reading it. I know that now." I studied him. "What did you think you were approving?" "A sale if the final terms were reasonable. I thought Northline would keep the brand, keep the employees who wanted to stay, and give Alyssa the room to grow it. And me?" He looked down at the table. "I thought you would finally have a chance to step back." "I never asked to step back. You never ask for anything that requires someone else to take over." The anger rose before I could stop it. "You wanted me in charge when the bank was calling. I was recovering from a stroke. And I was 23. I know. Do you?" He pressed his lips together. "Every time you remind me what you carried, I remember what I could not." There it was. He had not chosen Alyssa because he believed every word she said. He had chosen the version of the future that allowed him to feel useful again. That explained him. It did not excuse him. "You signed a support letter based on what made you feel better," I said. "More than 100 employees could have paid for that." Martin's shoulders lowered. "Alyssa said there would be placements. She told Grandma all 4 locations would stay open. I did not know that. She told Northline I had agreed in principle. I did not know that either." He sounded honest, but honesty after discovery was not the same as honesty before a decision. Before he left, he asked me not to destroy Alyssa's future over one mistake. "One mistake does not require this much concealment," I said. That evening, Ethan asked to meet at a coffee shop near the hotel. He had moved out of the honeymoon suite but had not left Alyssa. His wedding ring was still on his hand. He slid a printed copy of Alyssa's email across the table. "Is this accurate?" he asked. "Parts of it." "Which parts?" I rejected several proposals. Some deserved more consideration than I gave them. He seemed surprised. I admitted it. "And the rest?" She left out what Northline plans to consolidate. "Plans or has considered. The current integration model marks 3 locations for consolidation within 2 quarters. He rubbed his thumb over the edge of the paper. "Alyssa says those are preliminary scenarios. They may be preliminary. They are still the only written model we have." "Then what is your plan?" "To stop a transaction based on incomplete disclosure. That is not a plan for the company." The answer irritated me, because Marcus had already said the same thing. Ethan leaned forward. "If the business is under pressure, and Northline is the wrong answer, what is the right one?" "I am reviewing the numbers." "So you don't have one yet?" "Not one I'm willing to promise before I know it can work." He sat back. "Alyssa says that is how you keep everyone waiting for permission." I did not defend myself immediately. "I may have done that," I said, "but it does not make her version of this deal true." Ethan looked tired. "I don't know which one of you is using the company to fight the other." "Then don't choose yet. Ask for documents. Ask for dates. Ask who benefits. He folded Alyssa's email and placed it in his coat pocket. The next morning, Marcus and 3 location managers met with me. None of them had signed Northline's retention agreements. If Alyssa controls operations after the sale, I'm not staying, one manager said. Another agreed. I did not encourage them to resign. Make your own decision. Put your concerns in writing if Northline asks, but no threats and no coordinated walkout. Marcus watched me carefully. You know their interest drops if the management team leaves. Yes. And you're not going to use that? I'm not turning employees into leverage. He gave me the smallest nod. Northline noticed the risk anyway. That afternoon, Olivia Grant requested a call about management retention. I told her the truth. The agreements were unsigned, morale was unstable, and Northline needed to speak directly with each manager, rather than assume the brand guaranteed their loyalty. After the call, another restored file appeared in the shared data room. It was a preliminary role package for Alyssa. The title was Vice President of Brand Integration. The package included a salary increase, a transition incentive, and an additional bonus tied to completing the transaction and meeting cost reduction targets. None of it proved a crime. Companies regularly offered incentives to people they wanted to retain. What mattered was that Alyssa had never disclosed it to the other members, while urging us to approve the sale. I kept reading. Near the bottom of the attached forecast was a note about recent revenue changes. Material catering volume is already migrating outside legacy operations, reducing dependence on the existing 4-location structure. I read the sentence again. Mercer's Table did not have a new catering division. We had not approved an outside partnership. Priya had never reported a planned transfer. Someone had told Northline that our catering business was already moving elsewhere. The only question was where. The meeting began badly. I had asked the 4 location managers, Marcus, Priya, and Aunt Linda, to meet before lunch at the original restaurant. I expected questions about Northline, staffing, and the missing catering revenue. Instead, the youngest manager in the room closed the door and said, I don't want Alyssa running this company, but I don't want to go back to the way things were either. Her name was Jenna Cole. She managed our newest location and had been with us for almost 3 years. She was 30, organized, and usually careful about disagreeing with me in public. I folded my hands on the table. What exactly does that mean? It means every decision comes back to you. That is not true. Jenna glanced at the other managers. None of them looked away, which told me more than her words had. She continued, I can approve a schedule change, but if it affects overtime, Priya checks with you. I can replace a vendor, but only after you review the contract. I can change a menu special, but if the food cost moves by more than a few points, I have to wait for your answer. Those controls exist because mistakes at one location affect the entire company. I understand that, she said, but sometimes we wait so long for permission that the decision no longer matters. The answer rose to my tongue immediately. I wanted to remind her how many times I had caught pricing errors, prevented bad contracts, and covered shortages before they reached payroll. Then I looked around the table. Marcus was not defending me. Neither was Priya. I leaned back. How long have you all felt this way? A manager from our East Side location gave a humorless laugh. Do you want the honest answer or the answer that gets approved? The room went still. A week earlier, I would have ended the meeting right there. I would have called the remark disrespectful and brought everyone back to the numbers. Instead, I said, the honest one. For the next 40 minutes, I listened. They told me I corrected problems before anyone else could learn from them. They said I gave people responsibility, but took back authority the moment a decision made me uncomfortable. They said Alyssa had often been careless with details, but she made them feel as if ideas were allowed to exist before they were perfect. None of that excused what she had hidden, but refusing to hear it would have proved her description of me more accurate than I wanted. After the managers left for their lunch shifts, Priya stayed behind. She placed a folder on the table. These are Alyssa's older proposals, she said. I opened the first one. The online ordering plan was 18 months old. The original budget underestimated training costs, but the customer research was solid. The retail sauce proposal needed a manufacturing partner and better insurance analysis, yet the test market numbers were stronger than I remembered. Her event package included corporate lunches, rehearsal dinners, and private holiday bookings. My comments appeared at the bottom of each file. Incomplete budget. Insufficient staffing analysis. Not financially viable. I had identified real problems. I had not offered a path forward. On the sauce proposal, I had written only one sentence. Pretty packaging does not cover payroll. I remembered saying the same thing to Alyssa in my office. She had stood there holding sample labels she had paid for herself. I had believed I was teaching her to think like an operator. Reading the comment now, I saw that I had not taught her anything. I had simply reminded her that I was the person with the power to end the conversation. Priya watched me turn the pages. She had good ideas. She did. She also hid a private company and may have diverted leads. Both things can be true. That afternoon, I called the managers back one at a time, instead of forcing everyone into another long meeting. I told them I was creating a temporary operations council for 90 days. Each location manager would have authority within a defined budget. Vendor changes below a set threshold would no longer require my approval. Menu pilots could run for 4 weeks if food cost limits were documented. Staffing decisions would remain subject to payroll controls, but not every adjustment would come through me. Jenna studied the written limits. Is this temporary because Northline is watching? It is temporary because I want 90 days of evidence before we make it permanent. That sounds like you. It probably does. I met her eyes. But the authority is real. I did not apologize for refusing to sign the Northline transaction. I did apologize for building a system that made capable people wait for me before using their judgment. Marcus accepted the new structure without praising me for it. That's a start, he said. It was exactly the response I deserved. Grandma came by near closing with my mother's old reservation book tucked beneath her arm. She found me at the same corner table where we had sat after the wedding. I heard you gave away some of your power, she said. I delegated part of it. That is how people with power describe giving it away. I almost smiled. She opened the book to a page I had not seen the night of the wedding. My mother had written short notes beside the names of the people working for her at the time. Marcus sees a problem before it reaches the dining room. Linda remembers every promise. Caroline notices what everyone misses. Beside another name, my mother had written, "Let her make the mistake once. She will never make it twice." Grandma tapped the sentence. "Your mother trusted people differently," she said. She did not trust everyone with everything, but she gave them enough room to become more useful than they were on the first day. I thought keeping control was how I protected what she built. Sometimes it was. Grandma closed the book. Sometimes it was how you made sure no one could build beside you. The following morning, Priya asked me to come to her office. She had placed 2 reports side by side. The first showed catering inquiries from the previous 12 months. The second showed deposits and confirmed bookings. The inquiry volume did not collapse, she said. It dropped slightly, but not enough to explain the revenue decline. I studied the lines. How large is the gap? Too large. Why did this not trigger earlier? Because an inquiry is not booked revenue. A customer can call us, ask for pricing, and choose another company. If the lead is marked lost before a deposit, accounting sees no missing money. What did Alyssa mark them as? Mostly lost to competitor. Some declined. Some never qualified. Do we know who won the events? Not from our records. Marcus had mentioned seeing photographs from events with food that looked familiar. Priya pulled up several public posts. The menus were not identical, but the presentation, package names, and serving style resembled work Alyssa had developed while employed by Mercer's Table. It was suspicious. It was not proof. That proof arrived 2 hours later, because a customer called our main line. Her name was Mrs. Hartwell, and her company had booked holiday events with Mercer's Table for 6 years. She sounded embarrassed. "I may have paid the wrong account," she said. "Alyssa told me your catering division had a new name, but the invoice does not mention Mercer's Table." "What name does it use?" I asked. "Juniper Lane Events." I kept my voice even. Did you first contact Mercer's table? Yes. I called the same number I always call. Alyssa emailed me afterward and said she would handle everything. Have you paid a deposit? Yesterday. I asked her to forward the invoice and the email chain to Priya so we could confirm whether the companies were affiliated. The first email had been sent from Alyssa's Mercer's Table account. Thank you for contacting Mercer's Table regarding your annual leadership dinner. I'm moving your event to our specialized event channel so we can provide a more customized package. The next message came from Juniper Lane. The invoice listed a bank account we did not recognize. The address belonged to a private mailbox Ethan and Alyssa had used before the wedding. Priya searched Ohio's public business records while I read the email chain again. Juniper Lane Events had been formed in April of the previous year. Its statutory agent was a registered service company. Its manager was Alyssa Mercer. I felt anger first, then something colder. Alyssa had spent months telling everyone that Mercer's Table was losing catering business because I refused to modernize. She had used that decline to support a sale that would close 3 locations and give her a new executive title. Now I knew at least one customer had not left us at all. Alyssa had taken a call made to our company, answered it through our email system, and directed the customer into a business she controlled. I looked at the date on the invoice, then at the forecast Northline had received. For the first time, I understood that my sister had not been trying to sell a failing company. She had been helping it fail. My first instinct was to suspend Alyssa before lunch. I took the Juniper Lane invoice, the customer's email chain, and the Ohio business filing into our attorney's office and placed them on the conference table. She used our phone number, our email account, and our customer relationship to move business into a company she controls, I said. How much more cause do we need? Our attorney read the documents without reacting. Priya sat beside me with her laptop open, while Grandma Ruth joined us by video from her home. This is enough to justify an investigation, the attorney said. It is not enough to declare that every Juniper Lane contract belonged to Mercer's Table. The customer contacted us. This customer did. We still need to establish whether there is a pattern, how the other leads originated, and what actual damage the company suffered. I hated the distinction, but I understood it. Forming a separate business was not automatically illegal. Even competing with a family company might not be enough by itself. What mattered was whether Alyssa had used Mercer's Table's resources, confidential information, or business opportunities while hiding her interest. What can we do now? Ruth asked. Preserve company records, authorize an independent investigation, and restrict no one beyond what the operating agreement permits. I looked at the voting section again. An investigation required a majority of the total ownership. Ruth and I held 55% together. Martin joined the formal call that afternoon. I sent him the invoice and business filing in advance. He read the proposed resolution in silence. This is your sister, he said finally. She is also an officer of the company. You are treating her like a criminal. No, I am treating her like someone whose conduct needs to be examined. Ruth's voice came through the speaker. Martin, voting to investigate is not the same as deciding the outcome. He looked toward the camera. And if the investigation ruins her marriage and career, then perhaps the conduct being investigated will be the reason, Ruth said. Martin abstained. Ruth and I voted yes. The resolution appointed Graham Bell, a forensic accountant with no prior relationship to our family. His assignment was narrow. Identify catering leads that entered Mercer's Table's systems, determine whether they were transferred to Juniper Lane, and calculate any measurable financial effect. I wanted the investigation completed immediately. Graham told me that wanting speed was how people destroyed good evidence. Over the next 10 days, Priya preserved our customer database, company email, booking records, and access logs. No one opened Alyssa's personal email or private accounts. We examined only systems owned by Mercer's Table and records voluntarily provided by customers. The second customer had contacted us about a retirement dinner for 80 guests. She forwarded an email Alyssa had sent from her Mercer's Table account. I can offer you a more flexible package through our specialized event partner, Alyssa had written. The customer had never been told that Alyssa owned the partner. The third had called our East Side restaurant about a nonprofit fundraiser. The manager entered the inquiry into our customer system and assigned it to Alyssa because she handled larger events. 2 days later, the lead was marked lost to competitor. The event still happened. Juniper Lane issued the invoice. Neither customer had signed a contract or paid a deposit to Mercer's Table before being redirected. That meant I could not truthfully call the money stolen from our bank account. But Alyssa had received the opportunities because of her position with our company. She had used our staff, our reputation, and our systems to identify customers, then moved them to a business she had never disclosed. The access logs revealed the pattern. A lead would enter Mercer's Table's database. Alyssa would open it, change the status to declined or lost, and send an email from her company account. Within hours, the customer's information appeared in correspondence connected to Juniper Lane. Graham arranged the events by date. Once he did, the sequence became difficult to dismiss as coincidence. A former events assistant agreed to speak with him. She said Alyssa had instructed her to forward certain inquiries privately and not copy me. Alyssa said Caroline killed every new idea before it had a chance, the assistant told Graham. She said Juniper Lane was a test, and once it proved successful, the family would understand. The explanation sounded like Alyssa. She had probably believed it at first. That did not explain why the test remained secret after it became profitable, or why its missing revenue appeared in a forecast used to pressure us into selling. Ethan's attorney contacted ours near the end of the second week. Ethan had reviewed the household credit line he and Alyssa opened while they were engaged. Several charges were connected to Juniper Lane. Packaging samples, website development, a private mailbox, deposits to event vendors. Alyssa had described the expenses to him as wedding consulting and brand development work that would eventually be reimbursed. Ethan supplied statements from the account because his name and liability were attached to it. I never saw his unrelated personal transactions. Our attorneys shared only the pages connected to Juniper Lane. He had moved out of their shared home by then. I did not call him. Whatever happened to their marriage had to result from what he discovered, not from me recruiting him into my side of the fight. Graham delivered his preliminary report on a Friday morning. He estimated that approximately $310,000 in gross bookings showed signs of having been redirected during the previous 7 months. He emphasized the word gross. That amount was not profit. Juniper Lane had expenses. Mercer's Table would also have incurred food, labor, delivery, and insurance costs if we had handled the events. The final recoverable damage would be lower. The report also stated that Alyssa had not created every problem in our company. Food costs had risen. One location was underperforming. Our bank covenant was becoming harder to satisfy. Alyssa had not invented the pressure, but she had intensified it, hidden her role, and then presented the decline to Northline as proof that our existing structure had failed. Priya placed the forecast beside Graham's report. The same months with the sharpest decline in catering conversions were the months Alyssa used to argue that Northline was our only safe future. She created the wound, Priya said, then offered to sell the bandage. That afternoon, Alyssa's attorney sent us a formal demand. It accused me of retaliating against a minority member after a personal dispute at her wedding. It described Juniper Lane as an independent venture serving customers who had never legally belonged to Mercer's Table. Alyssa did not deny owning it. She did not deny receiving the events. Instead, she claimed no business opportunity had been diverted because none of the customers had signed contracts with us. I read that sentence several times. It was carefully written. It was also incomplete. Our logs showed that the customers had entered through Mercer's Table, been handled through Mercer's Table accounts, and been marked lost by Alyssa before appearing at Juniper Lane. She was betting everything on the difference between a customer we had already contracted and an opportunity she had been trusted to protect. For the first time, I could see exactly how she planned to defend herself. She would not deny what she had done. She would argue that she had the right to do it. Priya waited until the restaurant closed before showing me the revised cash flow forecast. She had covered the conference table with printouts from all 4 locations, each page marked with notes in her precise handwriting. The numbers were not catastrophic, but they were close enough to dangerous that I could no longer pretend stopping Northline would solve everything. Our food costs had risen for 3 straight quarters. The West Side location had missed its targets for 5 months, and the bank covenant tied to our operating line would be tested again before summer. "We are not insolvent," Priya said, "but if catering does not recover and the West Side location keeps losing money, we could breach the covenant by the end of the next quarter." "What happens then?" "The bank can demand tighter reporting, increase restrictions, or refuse to renew part of the line. They are unlikely to call everything immediately, but they will want proof that we have a credible plan." I looked at the column showing our remaining cash reserve, legal fees, Graham's investigation, and ordinary operating expenses had already reduced it. "How long do we have?" 3 months before the pressure becomes visible to everyone. Alyssa had exaggerated our weakness to justify the sale, but the weakness itself was real. That distinction mattered because I could not defend the company by acting as if every problem began with her. The following morning, Olivia Grant requested a call. Northline's position was simple. They would not keep due diligence open while ownership remained divided and the revenue data was under review. If we could not show a clear path to approval within days, they would suspend the process and move their resources elsewhere. "You understand that this is not a threat," Olivia said. "We cannot plan an integration without reliable disclosures or member support." "I understand. Do you intend to approve the transaction?" "Not under the current terms." "Then you should assume the offer may not remain available." When the call ended, I did not feel relief. Northline withdrawing would prevent Alyssa from closing 3 locations, but it would also remove the only immediate source of capital on the table. Ethan had been right about one thing. Saying no was not a plan. I called the location managers, Marcus, Priya, and Aunt Linda, into another meeting. This time, I did not arrive with a finished solution and ask them to approve it. I placed the forecast on the table and told them exactly how much time we had. Jenna read the West Side numbers first. "We need to cut hours." "Not across the board," Marcus said. "They already lose good people because the schedule changes every week." "Then we reduce the menu before we reduce the staff," she replied. "Half their weekday items barely sell." They argued for 10 minutes without looking at me for permission. I let them. By the end of the afternoon, we had the structure of a 90-day plan. We would contact every catering customer whose inquiry had been mishandled and offer a transparent explanation without discussing the investigation. We would negotiate a limited bridge extension with our bank, secured by tighter reporting and a freeze on unnecessary capital spending. The West Side location would reduce its menu and shorten 2 low-traffic evenings rather than close or cut every employee's hours. We would also test the ideas I had dismissed too quickly. Online ordering would begin as a pilot at 2 locations. A bottled sauce program would be limited to small batches sold in our own restaurants, not a national launch. Managers would receive authority to run 4-week menu experiments within approved cost limits. Profit sharing would not begin until we met cash flow targets, but the structure would be prepared in advance, so employees knew improvement would benefit them directly. Several of those ideas had started with Alyssa. "I wrote that into the plan," Marcus noticed. "You are keeping her name on them?" "They were her ideas. She will use that. Then she will be telling the truth." I had spent years believing leadership meant protecting the company from every imperfect proposal. Now I understood that rejecting a flawed version did not require burying the idea with it. Priya prepared the numbers, and the managers assigned responsibilities among themselves. For the first time in years, I left a planning meeting with tasks I did not personally control. That frightened me more than I admitted. It also felt like the first honest answer I had given Ethan. 2 days later, Olivia contacted our attorney again. Northline had opened an internal compliance review after learning that the catering forecast did not disclose Alyssa's ownership of Juniper Lane. Northline did not hand us its entire internal file. It provided only records connected to the representations made during the transaction. Among them was a meeting calendar, showing that Alyssa had attended a session titled Three Location Consolidation and Workforce Reduction. When I read the title, I remembered her telling Grandma that all 4 restaurants would stay open. Alyssa's attorney responded that attending a meeting did not prove she had agreed with every scenario discussed. That was technically true. Companies examined options they never adopted. But Alyssa had not told us the option existed at all. Ethan's attorney sent a separate notice that same week. Ethan had moved out of the house he shared with Alyssa and formally separated their finances. The household credit line remained a joint obligation, but no new charges could be made without both signatures. I learned that information through our attorney because part of the credit documentation overlapped with Juniper Lane. I did not call Ethan, and I did not ask anyone how Alyssa reacted. The marriage was not mine to end. Still, I knew she would blame me for it. Northline's preliminary compliance memo arrived on Friday afternoon. Most of it was cautious language about incomplete disclosures, inconsistent member support, and unresolved conflicts of interest. Then our attorney called my attention to one attached message. Alyssa had sent it to Northline's transaction lead before the wedding. "Caroline always comes back when people need her," the message said. "Once the family pressure lands, she'll sign." I read the words 3 times. The sentence did not prove Alyssa had planned every second of the ballroom confrontation. It did prove she had expected our family to isolate me until I gave her what she wanted. She believed I would return because I always had. When the payroll account was short, I found the money. When Martin made a bad decision, I corrected it. When Alyssa launched an idea without checking the cost, I repaired the damage before anyone else noticed. She had built her entire strategy around the assumption that I could be humiliated, excluded, and blamed, and I would still come back to save everyone. The member meeting was scheduled for the next morning at the original restaurant. By then, I had enough evidence to show that Alyssa had hidden her interests, redirected opportunities, and misrepresented the transaction. What I still needed to prove was that removing her plan would not destroy the people depending on us. For the first time, the choice was not between signing and refusing. It was between proving Alyssa had lied and proving I could lead without becoming the woman she said I was. We held the member meeting at the original Mercer's table before sunrise, when the dining room was still empty and the kitchen had not yet begun its morning prep. The same long table where my mother once reviewed invoices now held 4 voting folders: Graham Bell's preliminary report, Priya's 90-day plan, and the operating agreement that had kept our company alive through more than one family crisis. I took the chair closest to the window rather than the head of the table, but Alyssa noticed the choice and smiled as if it proved I was performing humility for an audience. She arrived with her attorney and a leather portfolio that matched the bag she had carried at the wedding. Martin came alone and sat between us, though no seat could make him neutral anymore. Grandma Ruth placed my mother's old reservation book beside her folder, then rested both hands on top of it without opening it. Our company attorney explained the purpose of the meeting. We were not deciding damages, criminal liability, or the final value of anyone's ownership interest. We were deciding whether Alyssa should remain an officer with access to company systems while the investigation continued, and whether Mercer's table would proceed with Northline's proposed transaction. Alyssa asked to speak first. She stood rather than remain seated, which turned the meeting into a presentation before anyone could stop her. She said Mercer's table faced rising costs, declining bookings, and an aging management structure. Northline, she argued, offered capital, technology, national distribution, and a path that did not depend on one person working until she collapsed. She did not say my name at first. Then she looked directly at me. "Caroline has convinced everyone that caution is the same thing as wisdom," she said. "For years, every new idea had to survive her suspicion before it was allowed to breathe." No one interrupted her because parts of that accusation were true. Alyssa held up the email, announcing the temporary investigation. She called it retaliation for what happened at the wedding, and said I had used my influence over Grandma, the managers, and our relatives to isolate her before removing her from power. According to Alyssa, Juniper Lane had served clients who had never signed contracts with Mercer's table, The closure documents were only preliminary planning scenarios, and the role Northline discussed with her was no different from any employment conversation during a business sale. "You can dislike how I handled my wedding," she said. "You can dislike that I built something Caroline did not approve, but neither of those things proves I harmed this company." Her attorney asked that the investigation be suspended and that the members vote immediately on whether to continue negotiating with Northline. He argued that delaying the transaction could cost all of us the best offer we would ever receive. When Alyssa sat down, everyone looked at me. I had spent most of my adult life believing the strongest answer was the one with no weakness in it. That morning, I knew the opposite was true. If I denied every flaw Alyssa had named, I would make it easier for her to hide her conduct inside my defensiveness. "I rejected some of Alyssa's ideas too quickly," I said. "I built systems that required too many decisions to come through me, and I made good managers feel as though authority lasted only until I disagreed with them." Alyssa's expression changed slightly. She had expected a denial, not an admission. I also spoke to her as if identifying a flaw in a proposal was the same as helping her improve it, I continued. "That was poor leadership. It damaged trust, and I am correcting it." I placed the Temporary Operations Council resolution on the table. "The managers now have defined authority. We have a 90-day plan that includes online ordering, a retail sauce pilot, and expanded event packages." Several of those ideas began with Alyssa, and the plan credits her for them. Martin looked toward Alyssa. She did not look back. "My mistakes do not make undisclosed conflicts acceptable," I said. "They do not give an officer the right to redirect opportunities received through company systems. They do not allow anyone to present conditional support as unanimous approval, or to tell one member that 4 restaurants will remain open while showing a buyer a consolidation model." Alyssa leaned forward. "You keep calling them company opportunities. None of those customers had signed with us." "They called our number," I said. "They entered our system. You answered them from our account. That does not mean we owned them." "No," I said. "It means you had a duty to disclose that you were sending them to a company you controlled." Her attorney objected that I was making a legal conclusion. Our attorney reminded everyone that the forensic accountant would present facts, not liability. Before Graham began, Grandma opened the reservation book. The leather binding made a soft, cracking sound in the silent dining room. She turned several pages, pausing over my mother's handwriting. "Elaine wrote down every person who helped this restaurant survive its first 5 years," Grandma said. "Not because they owned part of it, but because she believed a business should remember whose hands built it." She read a few names. Marcus, Linda, 2 former servers who later became managers. She did not read mine or Alyssa's. "I told Alyssa I would consider Northline if the employees were protected and the locations remained open," Grandma continued. "She told me that was the plan. I now know the only written integration model kept one location and reduced the workforce." Alyssa shook her head. "Grandma, that was one scenario. It was the scenario you did not show me. I was trying to keep you from being overwhelmed by technical documents." Grandma closed the book. "Do not confuse withholding with protecting." Graham connected his laptop to the screen at the end of the room. His presentation contained no dramatic graphics, only dates, customer records, email paths, and financial estimates. He began with the limits of his findings. Mercer's table had not lost $310,000 in cash from its bank account. That figure represented gross bookings associated with leads that showed signs of being redirected. The recoverable loss would be lower, after accounting for expenses, customer choice, and events we might not have secured. Then he showed the pattern. A catering inquiry entered our system. Alyssa opened it. The lead was marked lost, declined, or unqualified. An email went from Alyssa's company account to the customer. Juniper Lane later issued the invoice. 1 customer could have been a misunderstanding. 3 could have been poor judgment. The pattern across multiple months was something else. Graham displayed the email in which Alyssa called Juniper Lane our specialized event channel. Mercer's table had never owned, approved, or received income from that channel. Alyssa's attorney said she had been testing a new model that she intended to bring back to the company if it succeeded. Was that intention documented? Graham asked. Alyssa answered before her attorney could stop her. Not every business idea begins with a board resolution. No, Graham said, but an officer's ownership of the company receiving the opportunity is normally disclosed. Priya presented next. She did not pretend Mercer's table was healthy. Food costs were up. The West Side location was underperforming. Our bank covenant could become a problem before the end of the next quarter. Then, she showed the 90-day plan. We would freeze unnecessary renovations, negotiate a limited bridge extension, reduce the West Side menu, shorten 2 low-traffic evenings, recover catering clients, and launch controlled online ordering and retail pilots. The managers had approved the operating responsibilities assigned to them, and the profit-sharing structure would begin only after the company met specific cash flow targets. This is not guaranteed to work, Priya said. It is, however, financially supportable under conservative assumptions. Ethan had challenged me to offer something better than no. This was not a perfect answer, but it was an honest one. Our attorney then explained the voting rules. The sale required 75% approval. We did not have it. The investigation had been properly authorized by Ruth's and my combined 55%. Under the operating agreement, an officer under investigation for an undisclosed conflict could be temporarily suspended by a majority, excluding that officer's own interest. Alyssa turned to Martin. Dad, say something. He had spent the entire meeting staring at the documents without lifting his pen. I believed Northline would keep the people who wanted to stay, he said. They will keep some of them, Alyssa replied. No buyer guarantees every job. You told me the consolidation language was standard. It is. You told your grandmother all 4 locations would remain open. I said that was the goal. Grandma's voice remained calm. That is not what you said. Alyssa looked at me. This is what you wanted. You wanted all of them lined up against me. I wanted accurate information before anyone voted. You wanted to prove that I could not build anything without your permission. I could have answered with every lie we had uncovered. Instead, I said, you built Juniper Lane. You also built it with opportunities you received because we trusted you. The vote proceeded. I voted to suspend Alyssa temporarily from her officer role and operational access while the dispute was resolved. Grandma voted with me. Alyssa's 20% was excluded from the suspension vote because she was the officer under investigation. Martin could have voted against us, though it would not have changed the result. He abstained. That was not courage, and I did not mistake it for redemption. It was simply the first time he refused to rescue Alyssa from a consequence she had created. Northline joined the meeting by video an hour later. Olivia Grant said the transaction would be placed on indefinite hold. The reasons were not the wedding, the family walkout, or any personal complaint. Northline lacked the required member approval, could not rely on the revenue disclosures, faced a management retention risk, and had identified unresolved conflicts involving the person who had represented the transaction to them. Alyssa lost the Northline roll package at that moment, though Olivia did not say so directly. After the call ended, Alyssa gathered her papers. This company will fail, she said. And when it does, Caroline will tell all of you she was the only one who tried to save it. She left with her attorney before anyone replied. I thought the meeting was over. Then our attorney received Northline's preliminary compliance memo. The file contained a limited version history of the materials Alyssa had helped prepare. Northline had provided it because it related to the disclosures made during the proposed transaction. One slide concerned the future marketing value of my mother's story after consolidation. Alyssa had added a comment beside it. Keep Elaine's story. Strip out the operational detail. The family angle sells. I read the sentence slowly. She had not merely accepted the possibility that 3 restaurants would close. She had helped separate my mother's name from the employees, managers, and relatives who had kept that name alive. Grandma placed one hand over the reservation book. For the first time that morning, Martin looked ashamed. A process server arrived at the restaurant before noon. Alyssa had filed suit. Her complaint claimed I had used a family disagreement to retaliate against a minority member, interfered with a legitimate sale, and begun an investigation to force down the value of her ownership. It said Juniper Lane had never accepted an opportunity legally belonging to Mercer's Table and described the Northline closure materials as hypothetical scenarios rather than decisions. The filing did not deny the emails, the business records, or the meetings. It tried to redefine what they meant. Alyssa had lost her role, her access, and the transaction she believed would free her from my shadow. Now she intended to make the company pay until I gave them back. The lawsuit did not stop the restaurants from opening the next morning. That was the first lesson the next 2 months taught me. Family disasters felt enormous inside conference rooms and legal filings, but at 6:30 every day, someone still had to unlock the doors, check the refrigerators, count the cash drawers, and make sure the first shift showed up. Our 90-day plan began while Alyssa's complaint moved through the court. The West Side location shortened 2 slow evenings and reduced its menu instead of cutting the entire staff. Online ordering launched at 2 restaurants. The first version had problems, but the managers corrected them without waiting for me to approve every change. Priya negotiated tighter reporting with our bank and secured a limited extension on the operating line. Catering inquiries slowly began turning into deposits again. The company was not suddenly healthy. Legal fees and Graham's investigation reduced our cash reserve, and every decision had to be weighed against payroll, food costs, and debt. But we were still operating. More importantly, the Operations Council was operating without me controlling every detail. I attended the meetings, asked questions, and forced myself not to answer problems before the managers had a chance to solve them. Sometimes they chose differently than I would have. Most of the time, the business survived the difference. Alyssa's lawsuit entered limited discovery in May. The judge did not order us to open every private email or expose every family argument. The exchange was restricted to the subjects Alyssa had placed in dispute: Juniper Lane, the Northline transaction, the approval process, the value of her ownership, and whether I had retaliated against her. That limitation protected both of us. It also meant Alyssa could no longer rely only on broad accusations. Her attorney requested our meeting minutes, the forensic report, the operating agreement, and the documents supporting her suspension. We produced them. Our attorney requested Juniper Lane's event records, communications involving Mercer's Table leads, Northline disclosures, and documents connected to the roll package Alyssa had been offered. She objected to almost everything. Eventually, the records arrived in pieces. The deposition took place in June at a law office downtown. I sat beside our attorney while Alyssa took the seat across from us. She wore a cream-colored suit and no wedding ring. She did not look defeated. She looked prepared. Her attorney had clearly taught her not to deny documents that could be placed in front of her. Instead, she narrowed every answer until responsibility almost disappeared. Juniper Lane, she said, had served customers who were free to choose any provider. The leads had not belonged to Mercer's Table because no contract had been signed. The closure documents had been planning scenarios, not final decisions. The Northline roll package had been preliminary and had not influenced her support for the transaction. The wedding walkout had been a public retaliation campaign created by my influence over our family. Each statement contained enough truth to sound reasonable by itself. Our attorney began with Mrs. Hartwell's inquiry. Did she contact Mercer's Table first? Yes. Did she contact you through a Mercer's Table account? Yes. Did you disclose that you own Juniper Lane? I told her I was moving the event to a specialized channel. That was not my question. Alyssa's jaw tightened. I did not believe a separate disclosure was necessary because no agreement existed with Mercer's Table. The attorney placed the email beside the CRM log. You marked the lead lost to a competitor before Juniper Lane issued its invoice. I considered Juniper Lane a separate provider. Then why did you describe it to the customer as our specialized event channel? Alyssa paused. My language may have been imprecise. The next customer followed the same pattern. Then the next. By the 5th lead, imprecise no longer sounded accidental. The Northline records were worse. Alyssa admitted attending the consolidation meeting, but said attendance did not mean agreement. Our attorney showed her the version history, proving she had edited a slide about preserving the Mercer family story after workforce reductions. She said she had only improved the marketing language. He showed her comment about removing operational detail because the family angle sold better. She said she meant the presentation contained too much technical material for consumers. He showed her the message predicting I would sign once family pressure landed. She said she had been expressing frustration, not describing a strategy. The answers were polished, but the pattern was clear. Every time the documents showed intent, Alyssa renamed it as interpretation. At one point, our attorney began asking about the reception and whether Alyssa had deliberately used the wedding to humiliate me. His next question moved toward the details of her marriage and what Ethan had said after the ballroom emptied. I touched his sleeve. "We don't need that," I said. Alyssa looked at me for the first time since the deposition began. Our attorney leaned closer. "It may go to motive. The records already show motive. We don't need to humiliate her." The room was quiet for a moment. Then he withdrew the question and returned to the wedding thread messages. Those were enough. The coordinator's message established that Alyssa had moved my seat 2 days after I refused to sign. Grandma's response established that no one had instructed her to return my place card. Northline's message established that Alyssa expected family pressure to change my decision. The walkout had not been planned by me. The isolation had been anticipated by her. By the end of the deposition, Alyssa's control had begun to crack. "You always do this," she said after our attorney asked whether Juniper Lane had used a proposal she originally created for Mercer's table. "You take every good thing I build and decide whether it deserves to exist." Her attorney told her not to argue. She ignored him. "I created the event program. I created the packages. I brought those customers to the brand, and then redirected them to a company you owned," our attorney said. Because Caroline would have killed the idea. The statement hung in the room. It was the closest Alyssa came to admitting why she had done it. She believed being overlooked gave her permission to take the opportunity somewhere else. Once she accepted that logic, hiding the company, distorting the forecast, and pressuring the family became steps toward a future she thought she had already earned. Northline completed its internal review the following week. Olivia Grant sent formal notice that the company was rescinding the non-binding support arrangement and ending all role discussions with Alyssa. The letter cited unreliable disclosures, unresolved ownership approval, management retention risk, and inconsistencies in the catering data. Northline did not accuse Alyssa of a crime. It simply concluded that it could not trust the information behind the transaction. Without Northline, Alyssa lost the executive title, transition incentive, and national platform she had used to justify everything else. Ethan filed for divorce near the end of July. I learned through our attorneys because the household credit line appeared in both disputes. His filing did not mention me or the wedding walkout as the cause. It referred to undisclosed business obligations, financial misrepresentations, and the breakdown of trust. The divorce was not final. No judge divided their property that summer, and no one walked out of court suddenly free of every financial connection. Ethan remained responsible for the joint credit line until it was refinanced or resolved. Alyssa remained responsible for the obligations tied to Juniper Lane. Their marriage ended the same way the Northline deal did. Not because I told anyone to leave, but because Alyssa had made commitment impossible without accurate information. Our own case could have continued for another year. The lawyers warned us that trial would consume more cash, expose more private records, and leave the value of Alyssa's 20% interest uncertain. Even if Mercer's table won, collecting damages and completing a forced buyout could take longer than the company could afford. I had 3 options. I could hide part of what happened to protect the family's reputation. I could pursue every claim until Alyssa had nothing left. Or I could require accountability, without allowing the legal fight to destroy the same company I was trying to save. We entered settlement negotiations. An independent valuation firm assessed Alyssa's ownership. Graham separated gross bookings from actual loss and calculated the net benefit Juniper Lane had received from the diverted opportunities. Neither I nor Alyssa was allowed to invent a number that suited us. The final agreement required her to leave every management role, surrender company customer data, and repay the agreed net benefit and documented damages. Those amounts were deducted from the value of her interest. She received a moderate initial payment. The rest would be paid through a promissory note over several years, subject to the company's ability to maintain operations. She did not receive the large cash exit she had expected from Northline. The agreement also prohibited her from using Mercer's table trademarks, confusingly similar trade dress, licensed images of our mother, or company marketing materials. She could start another business. She could use her own name, her own designs, and her own ideas. She just could not sell herself as the official continuation of something she no longer controlled. Martin came to my condo the night before we signed. "She will have debt, no job, and a divorce to pay for," he said. "Can't you reduce the repayment?" The figure came from an independent accountant. "She is your sister." That did not stop her from billing our customers. "She has already lost enough." I looked at him across my kitchen counter. "You said the same thing when we voted to investigate her." "I am trying to keep this family together." "No, you are trying to remove the consequence before she has to carry it." His face tightened. "I'm not taking her future," I said. "I'm stopping her from paying for it with ours." He left without answering. The settlement was signed in early July. For 3 weeks, I believed the worst of the conflict was finished. Then our attorney forwarded a domain registration for Mercer House Provisions. The domain had not been purchased after the settlement. It had been registered months before the wedding. Attached to it was an investor presentation Alyssa had been developing in secret. The color palette resembled Mercer's table. The packaging used one of the licensed photographs of my mother. The brand story described Alyssa as the creative force who had transformed a local family restaurant into a modern food company. The presentation included a launch date at another hotel ballroom. It also included a customer list that matched an export from our system, made shortly before Alyssa lost access. She had prepared a second future before the first one collapsed. This time, she did not need my signature. She only needed investors to believe that the Mercer name, our mother's image, and our customers belonged to her. 2 days later, an invitation arrived in my email. "Come see what the brand looks like without you controlling it." I did not answer. Alyssa had already shown me what she could build with things that were not hers. Now I intended to find out whether anyone else would pay for it. I did not attend Alyssa's launch. Our attorney sent a narrow notice instead. It did not demand that she abandon the business or stop selling food products. It required her to remove Mercer's table's trade dress, stop using the licensed photograph of our mother, return the exported customer data, and withdraw any statement suggesting Mercer House Provisions was the official continuation of our company. I read the final draft twice before approving it. There was no threat to destroy her career. No demand that she disappear. No attempt to claim every recipe, memory, or idea she had ever touched. Alyssa was free to build something of her own. She was not free to build it with our customers, our mother's image, and a brand identity she had already agreed not to use. Her investors received copies because the customer list and trademark claims appeared in the presentation Alyssa had given them. From that point forward, the consequences developed without my help. Their attorneys reviewed the domain history and discovered that Alyssa had registered Mercer House months before the wedding. They compared the investor deck with the settlement restrictions. They examined the access logs showing when the customer list had been exported and asked Alyssa to prove that every contact had agreed to hear from her new business. She could not. One of the investors also contacted the packaging supplier. The supplier produced an email in which Alyssa had asked them to keep the recognizable Mercer look, while changing enough details to make the brand appear separate. Within 4 days, both major investors withdrew. The packaging supplier stopped production until ownership of the designs could be confirmed. The hotel hosting the launch required an additional payment guarantee after the investors pulled out. Alyssa did not provide it by the deadline. The venue canceled the event. I learned that from the hotel manager's email, not from gossip. The manager confirmed that the final balance had not been secured and that the ballroom had been closed before the formal presentation began. A cousin who had received an invitation arrived before the cancellation notice reached every guest. She later sent Grandma a photograph, and Grandma showed it to me. The ballroom was almost painfully beautiful. Round tables were covered in cream linen. Gold menus rested beside unopened wine glasses. A large screen displayed the Mercer House logo over a faded photograph of my mother standing outside the first restaurant. Most of the chairs were empty. There was no Grandma Ruth at the family table. No Aunt Linda. No Ethan. No restaurant managers. No Northline representatives. No investors waiting near the stage. At her wedding, Alyssa had tried to create a room where I no longer belonged. 5 months later, she had created a room that belonged entirely to her. No one stayed to share it. She called me that evening. "You took everything from me," she said. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear something breaking beneath it. "I did not call your investors," I said. "I did not cancel the ballroom. You knew what would happen when you sent that notice. I knew they would ask questions. You made sure I could not use anything. I made sure you could not use things that were not yours." There was a long silence. "You want me to start with nothing," she said. "No. You still have your education, your experience, your ideas, and your talent. Start with those. You never believed my talent was enough. That was one of my mistakes." She did not expect the admission, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then I added, "But being underestimated did not give you the right to take our customers or lie about what you owned." Her breathing sharpened. "So what am I supposed to do now? Build something that does not require everyone else to lose for you to win." She accused me of sounding like our mother. I almost told her that she had spent months selling our mother's story while discarding everything Elaine had valued. Instead, I said only what mattered. "Use your own name, Alyssa. Let your own work be enough." She ended the call. We did not reconcile that night. By August, Mercer's Table had not transformed into a perfect company. The West Side restaurant still struggled, so we reduced its hours and simplified the menu instead of hiding the problem. Catering revenue was recovering, though not yet back to its previous level. Online ordering performed well enough to expand to a third location. The bottled sauce pilot sold out twice, but Priya refused to increase production until we understood the true margins. Alyssa had been right about its potential. I made sure the internal project record credited her original proposal. The operations council became permanent. Location managers could approve vendor agreements and menu tests within established limits. Related party transactions required written disclosure. Major operating decisions needed review from someone other than me. I voted for every restriction. That surprised Martin more than anyone. He retired from daily involvement and stopped attending management meetings. He apologized to me once, then became frustrated when the apology did not restore 15 years of trust. I told him trust was not a switch he could turn back on when he felt ready. We began with shorter conversations. It was not forgiveness, but it was more honest than pretending nothing had happened. Grandma kept her ownership and demanded a written succession plan before the end of the year. Ethan's divorce from Melissa remained unresolved. I heard that he had moved into an apartment and was negotiating responsibility for the household credit line. I did not contact him. Alyssa found contract branding work with a smaller company outside Lakeview. She was still making payments under the settlement. She had not asked to return to Mercer's Table, and no one had offered. That was where things stood when Grandma arranged a private dinner at the original restaurant. There were no reporters, lawyers, or investors. Only family, managers, and employees who had carried the company through the previous 5 months. A chair had been placed for me at the head of the long table. I moved it. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You know someone will put it back, then they can sit in it." I placed my mother's old reservation book in the center of the table and took a seat between Priya and Aunt Linda. No one was sent to another table. No one was asked to prove they belonged. The night Alyssa pulled my chair away, she thought she was deciding who counted as family. What she actually showed us was who had been holding the table together. She also showed me why no one person should ever have to hold it alone again. When someone excludes you to control you, do not beg for a seat or react in anger. Step back, Document what happened, protect your rights, and let facts expose the truth. You should remember that being overlooked never gives you permission to steal, deceive, or harm others. Real leadership means sharing responsibility, admitting your mistakes, and setting boundaries without becoming cruel. If this story taught you something useful, subscribe to the channel and stay for more family lessons and stories.